Carving demonstration. Permanent maxillary right central incisor. 1.5-inch wax block is used for carving this teeth. From one end of the wax block, measure about 10.5 mm using the metal scale and mark it using the wax carver. Then draw lines parallel to the edge of the block on all the four surfaces exactly at the same measurement. This line corresponds to the cervical line of the tooth. The 9 mm part of the wax block is used for carving the crown part, and the other part is used for carving the root. After demarcating the crown and the root, the individual surfaces are labeled on the root part of the wax block. Labial view, mesial view, palatal view and the distal view. For carving the labial surface and the palatal surface, draw the labial and the palatal outlines of the crown on the mesial side of the crown part. Similarly, draw the labial and the palatal outlines on the distal side. The labial outline should be convex in the middle and the cervical third, and it should be flat at the incisal third level. The palatal outline should be convex in the cervical third, denoting the cingulum, and concave in the middle and the incisal third, denoting the fossa. That is, it should have an S-shaped outline. Now, the labial surface is carved by slowly removing wax on the labial aspect in the middle and the incisal third, and thereby creating a smooth, flat labial surface. Now, following the labial outline drawn on the proximal sides, the labial convexity in the cervical third is created by removing wax near the cervical line. Next, the palatal surface is carved. This is carved by removing wax on the palatal aspect in the middle and the incisal third. The wax in this area should be removed more to create a concavity in the middle and the incisal third, which will correspond to the palatal fossa. Now, by following the palatal outline drawn on the proximal sides, the palatal convexity in the cervical third is created by removing the wax near the cervical line. This palatal convexity corresponds to the cingulum and should be smoothened and made prominent by deepening the concavity in the middle and the incisal third. This is the labial aspect showing the carved labial surface of the crown. This is the palatal surface showing the carved palatal surface of the crown. This is the mesial aspect showing the carved labial and the palatal outlines of the crown. This is the distal aspect showing the carved labial and palatal outlines of the crown. Next, draw the proximal outlines on the labial and palatal aspect of the crown. On the labial surface, draw the proximal outline starting from the mesio-incisal and the disto-incisal edge up to the cervical line to about 0.5 mm short of the edge of the block. Similarly, on the palatal surface, draw the proximal outline starting from the mesio-incisal and disto-incisal edge up to the cervical line to about 1 mm short of the edge of the block. This 0.5 mm difference between the labial and the palatal surface corresponds to the palatal convergence of the crown. This is the labial and the palatal aspect showing the proximal outlines. Now, carve the proximal aspect by slowly removing the wax on the mesial surface starting from the mesiolabial edge and moving towards the mesiopalatal edge. Next, the distal surface is carved by slowly removing the wax from the distolabial edge and moving towards the distopalatal edge. The carving of the proximal aspect is otherwise called as the proximal reduction and should follow the mesial and the distal outlines drawn on the labial and the palatal aspects. This is the labial view showing the carved proximal surfaces. From the incisor edge of the wax block, measure 23.5 mm using the metal scale and mark it using the wax cover. And then draw lines on all the 4 surfaces exactly at the same measurement. This line corresponds to the apex of the tooth. This is the labial aspect showing the marked measurement of the tooth. Now, remove the excess wax exactly at the marked end of the line, which corresponds to the apex. Next, draw the mesial and the distal outline of the root on the labial aspect of the root part. Similarly, the mesial and the distal outline of the root is drawn on the palatal aspect of the root part. But this outline should be 0.5 mm less than the labial aspect. This 0.5 mm difference corresponds to the palatal convergence of the root. This is the labial and palatal aspects showing the proximal root outlines. Now, the proximal surface of the root is carved by slowly removing wax from the cervical line up to the apical end. This is how a completed proximal outline should be on one side. Next, the other proximal surface of the root is carved in a similar way by slowly removing wax from the cervical line up to the apical end. While carving the proximal outline of the root, the carving should follow the outlines drawn previously on the labial and the palatal aspects. This is the labial and the palatal aspects showing the carved proximal outlines of the root. Next, draw the labial and the palatal outline of the root on the distal aspect of the root part of the wax block. Similarly, the labial and the palatal outline of the root is drawn on the mesial aspect of the root part. This is the mesial and the distal aspects showing the labial and the palatal outlines of the root. Now, the labial surface of the root is carved by slowly removing wax from the cervical line up to the apical end. This is how a completed labial root outline should be. Next, the palatal surface of the root is also carved in a similar way by slowly removing wax from the cervical line up to the apical end. This is the mesial and the distal aspects showing the carved labial and the palatal outlines of the root. Next, the cervical line is drawn on the labial, distal, palatal, and the mesial aspects. This is how the cervical line should be drawn on all the different aspects of the carved tooth. The cervical construction is then carved by slowly removing wax from the crown towards the marked cervical line. This is done on all the surfaces of the carved tooth. the labial, mesial, palatal and distal aspects showing the partly carved cervical constriction. Next, the cervical constriction is carved by slowly removing wax from the root towards the marked cervical line. This is also done on all the surfaces of the carved tooth. After carving the cervical constriction, the root part should be smoothened to remove any excess elevations. This is the labial, mesial, palatal and the distal aspects showing the carved cervical constriction. Next, in the palatal surface of the crown part of the tooth, the M-shaped palatal outline is drawn. This is the palatal outline of the palatal surface of the crown. The center of the M outline corresponds to the palatal fossa and the proximal sides correspond to the mesial and distal marginal ridges. Now, the palatal fossa is carved by slowly removing wax from the fossa area. After carving the palatal fossa, the marginal ridges and the cingulum are rounded so that it merges with the fossa. By using the scooped end of the wax carver, the palatal fossa is carved accurately below the cingulum area. This is the carved palatal surface of the crown. Next, the mesial and the distal surfaces should be smoothened. Finally, the mesio-incisal angle should be made sharp . And the disto-incisal angle should be made rounded. The carved tooth should be checked for any discrepancies in the dimensions, and the excess wax should be removed in the crown as well as the root part. This is the labial aspect, mesial aspect, palatal aspect and the distal aspect. Next, the distal curvature of the root is carved in the apical third by removing wax in the apical third of the root. Then, the root apex is rounded on all the sides. This is the labial aspect showing the distal curvature of the root. This is the completed labial aspect, mesial aspect, palatal aspect and the distal aspect. Preliminary polishing is done using the rough polishing cloth by rubbing gently on all the surfaces. Then, the yellow polishing cloth is used for polishing by rubbing gently on all the surfaces. While using the polishing cloth, forceful rubbing should be avoided to prevent any changes in the contours of the carved tooth. The final polishing is done using either a cotton or a tissue paper dipped in soap water. After polishing in soap water, the carved tooth is dried using a dry tissue paper. This is the final labial aspect, mesial aspect, palatal aspect, distal aspect and incisal aspect of the permanent maxillary right central incisor. This shows the different stages of tooth carving up to the completed tooth.